Michael Burry warns of hyperinflation. I'm going to reveal why he's giving this warning. I'm also going to give you a timeline on when you could expect hyperinflation right here in the United States. And I'm going to give you signals that you can look for that will show you it's right around the corner. And I'm going to explain this all to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over Michael Burry and his tweet storm from the other day comparing the United States and Weimar Germany. Editor, let's go right to the internet. He's actually deleted his tweets, so we're going to go to an article that captured them from Business Insider titled Big Short Investor Michael Burry says prepare for inflation. He also warns Bitcoin and gold may be at risk. I don't want to get too far off on a tangent. That's for a completely separate video. So let's focus on the comparisons to Weimar Germany. In the first tweet, prepare for #inflation, the investor said in a new deleted tweet on Thursday night, reopening and stimulus on the way. Pre-COVID, it took $3 of new government debt to create $1 of GDP, and now it's worse. In an inflationary crisis, governments will move to squash competitors in the currency arena. He's referring to Bitcoin and gold. He also references a fantastic book that we're going to get to later on in this video. It's called Dying of Money, Lessons of the Great German and American Inflations. The book is by Jens O. Parson, which is actually a pseudonym. I'm not sure what his name actually was. And I believe it was written actually in 1974. I'm in the process of reading it right now. Next tweet, Germany, and he's comparing it now, Weimar Germany, to the United States, started by not paying adequately for its war. And you could compare this to our current war, if you will, on the cerveza sickness and the fallout from the GFC. Out of the sacrifices of its people, taxes. But it covered its deficits with war loans, treasuries, and issues of new paper Reichsmarks, or in this case, dollars. So what he's saying is all of the deficit spending we have had since the GFC, and especially as of 2020 into 2021 because of the cerveza sickness, we didn't do that by collecting more taxes. The government spent all that additional money as a result of issuing more treasuries and creating more currency units in the real economy. In other words, more bank deposits, more M2 money supply. That's another thing we'll touch on in just a moment. And I like his hashtag here, doomed to repeat. And I also like his next quote, hashtag history is not useless. And he goes on to point out something that just preceded the big German hyperinflation that I never knew took place. Check this out. Before the German hyperinflation in the 1920s, everyone from the elevator operator up was playing the market. And volumes became such that the financial industry could not keep up with the paperwork. And the Bourse, which is their word for the stock market, was obliged to close. Sound familiar? Hashtag Robinhood down. So let's start by going over why Michael Burry mentioned that the government now has to borrow and spend $3 to create $1 of GDP. Actually, more specifically, he said that was prior to the cerveza sickness. And now, who knows how much they have to spend to create that dollar of GDP. Maybe $4, even $5. And the reason he highlighted this is to show that if we want to get unemployment down to where it was prior to the cerveza sickness. Right now, that's the Fed's #1 mandate. They've told us that over and over and over again. Most likely, we'll have to get nominal GDP to increase. Well, the only way to get nominal GDP to increase by $1 is for the government, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, to spend $5. And keep in mind, that's dollars they're getting not from taxes, as Michael Burry pointed out, but they're getting by selling bonds. And the way they're doing that is creating more currency units, more broad money in the real economy, chasing goods and services. We're going to go over how that works in just a moment. So the main key we're going to emphasize throughout this entire video is we have to focus on what is happening to the amount of deposits in the real economy, the amount of deposits in the commercial banking system, because that's what's going to create inflation, stagflation, or even hyperinflation. And Michael Burry references this specifically in another tweet where he gives a hat tip and uses a chart from my good friend and partner in Rebel Capitalist Pro, Lynn Alden. Do not underestimate the power of stimulus checks. This chart, courtesy of Lynn Alden, compares M2 money to QE assets to direct cash payments in green. Those checks play a big role, and unlike QE, direct payments don't trap inflation in the securities markets. Hashtag helicopter money. So let's break down the chart of Lynn's that Michael Burry used in that tweet. This is really going to help us understand what's going on and why the United States could experience inflation or even hyperinflation when a country that we're always compared to, such as Japan, has experienced disinflation or even at some points in time, deflation. So it starts by looking at the chart of the Fed's balance sheet. Now, what Lynn did is she combined all of these charts, but I'm separating them to make it a little more clear. So the Fed's balance sheet goes back to 2006 all the way to today's date. On the left, we go from 0 up to 5 trillion down to a -1 trillion. And keep in mind, these charts don't represent an aggregate total of the trillions of dollars on the Fed's balance sheet or M2 or government payments, which we'll get to in a moment, but they represent an increase or decrease in the amount. So the Fed's balance sheet is pretty much the same. It was right around 800 billion prior to the GFC. Then they started quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. So during each round, their balance sheet was going up significantly. But during quantitative tightening, remember back in 2018, they started selling treasuries or assets on their balance sheet, which reduced the amount of bank reserves in the system. Then the market went into the taper tantrum. Remember, it absolutely tanked, almost went down by 20% when it was supposed to be like watching paint dry. Remember, I think Janet Yellen told us that. But Jerome Powell had to reverse course, drop interest rates, and start quantitative easing again, especially when we had the repo spike. And then you know what happened in March of 2020. All hell breaks loose, and the Fed's balance sheet goes parabolic when they institute quantitative easing infinity. But the takeaway from this chart is to notice how the Fed's balance sheet has gone straight up in 2020. Now let's look at a chart of government transfer payments. So this would be stimmy checks, increased unemployment, etc. And it's the same timeline on all these, in fact, from 2006 to 2020. So the transfer payments increased slightly during the GFC, and there really isn't anything until we get to March 2020, and then it just goes parabolic. But notice it's going straight up just like the Fed's balance sheet. And the Fed's balance sheet doesn't necessarily have to correspond with the government transfer payments. If they were taxing individuals, and taking that money out of the economy. Even if they weren't taxing it, even if they were just selling the bonds to the average Joe and Jane or corporation XYZ, the Fed's balance sheet really wouldn't change because the Fed isn't involved in the transaction. It's just between the Treasury and the entity or the individual in the real economy. But let's think this through. If an entity or individual buys a treasury at auction from Janet Yellen herself, let's say, they're going to use money they have or currency units in the commercial banking system. They have a checking account, let's say. That's a deposit, that's a liability of the commercial banking system. That's M2 money supply. That's broad money. Okay, well, if they give that $1 billion, let's say, to Janet Yellen, it goes into the Treasury General Account that's held at the Federal Reserve. So now there's $1 billion less of deposits in the commercial banking system. Therefore, there's fewer currency units that are out there chasing goods and services. But what happens when Janet Yellen sends out those stimmy checks? The currency she pulled out of the system goes right back in. So on net balance, it's a wash. But what happens if the banks buy the treasuries directly from Janet Yellen and then flip them to the Fed? Well, that would make the Fed's balance sheet go up because they have to create more bank reserves to buy those treasuries from the commercial banking system that bought them from Janet Yellen. But you see what's happened here is there haven't been any currency units extracted from the real economy. The bank deposits or the commercial bank deposits didn't go down first. They remained the same. Therefore, if the Fed is buying these treasuries basically directly from Janet Yellen through that shell game with the primary dealer banks, when Janet Yellen spends the money back into the economy, it's going to increase on net balance the total of currency units in the real economy. In other words, it's going to increase the amount of deposits in the commercial banking system. It's going to increase M2 and it's going to increase broad money supply. And that's exactly what's being illustrated by this final chart of M2 money supply. Same timeline, but notice when the Fed was doing QE 1, 2, and 3, M2 money supply wasn't going up at the same pace. Now, all of a sudden, it's going up at the exact same rate, going Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond. It's going up at the same rate as the Fed's balance sheet. And again, what this is telling us is the Fed is monetizing the government deficits. And if they continue to do so, they're also going to continue to increase the money supply. So the point Michael Burry is trying to make by using Lynn Alden's chart is to illustrate if the government continues to deficit spend like a drunken sailor, and that's monetized by the Federal Reserve, we're getting closer and closer to hyperinflation every single day. The question becomes, how close are we right now? Step number 2, the timeline to hyperinflation and signals you can look out for. To start this step, we're going to go right back to the book Michael Burry referenced called Dying of Money. The first passage from the book I want to highlight is Germany's inflation cycle ran not for a year, but for 9 years, representing 8 years of a gestation period and only 1 year of the actual collapse. So what this shows us is the seeds of hyperinflation, or any inflation for that matter, are sown far prior to actually seeing the effects in the real economy. The book goes on to point out, inflation, in the sense of rising prices, initially was moderate. Domestic prices only a bit more than doubled to the end of the war in 1918. So the period was from 1914 to 1918, about 4 or 5 years. At the same time, the government's money supply had increased by 9 times. So inflation only goes up, only doubles, but the money supply, or M2 broad money, goes up 9 times. And the government's debt increased by an even larger amount. And I think this next part is extremely powerful when you think about it in terms of what we're seeing today. So long as the government in this way could spend money it did not have faster than the value of the money could fall, Germany had both its war and life as usual at the same time, which was the same thing as having the war free of charge. And for today, I would just replace the war with, let's call it the war on the cerveza sickness. I would replace the word war with stimulus or government spending, MMT, UBI, whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing. Back in Germany, during this time frame, they thought they were getting a free lunch. The exact same thing we're being told today by the politicians and the central bankers. So let's take those numbers and apply them to what we have today. We can kind of think through a timeline and go over signals that could tell us we're sowing the seeds of hyperinflation right now. So we have a chart of M2 money supply. This is different than the one we had in step number 1, which showed us the increase or the decrease in money supply. This is actually showing us an aggregate total. So it starts 1960, goes all the way to 2021. On the left, we go from 2 trillion up to $20 trillion. And you'll notice right here in the middle, I'm just beating you over the head with that idea I've been going over so much. And that's the commercial bank's balance sheet is the difference between the currency units in the real economy and what's going on in the financial economy. So if we want to figure out inflation, stagflation, hyperinflation, we've got to focus on the deposits or the liabilities of the commercial banking system. And anything that happens between the Fed and the banks exclusively really affects the financial economy. We're not really worried about that for this video. What we are worried about is the transactions between the Fed, the bank, and the government, which lead to an increase in money supply, or M2, or an increase in the deposits of the commercial banking system. I think you've heard it enough. Okay, moving on to this chart. We see it go up. It flattens out in the 1990s when we saw velocity of money really increase. But then we see it go up again. Of course, we know what happens during the GFC. It starts to go up at a little slower pace, maybe in 2015. But we know what happened in 2020. It goes straight up. And what Lynn pointed out in her awesome chart that Michael Burry referenced is that since 2020, the money supply, or the currency units in the real economy, have increased by 25% in just 1 year. Now let's go over the timeline they highlighted in the book. Started in 1914, went all the way to 1923. And this is a chart of the mark, the German mark, Reichsmark, against the dollar. So it's not exactly the CPI, but it's similar. So we'll use this chart as a starting point. And I want to highlight that, like the book said, from 1914 to 1918, Inflation didn't go up that much, at least not compared to what we saw in 1923. That's for sure, where it just goes straight up. But what I want to focus on is the 4 or 5 years between 1914 and 1918, because that's when the seeds of the hyperinflation were actually sown. So let's think this through using today's numbers. So 1914 to 1918, we'll say the CPI increased, consumer prices increased by 100%. To break this down by year, this would be 15% compounded over 5 years. Shadow Stats tells us that their inflation rate is about 10%, and that's using the same government measurements they used prior to 1980. In other words, back in the 1970s, when the government actually would admit we had stagflation. So let's be conservative and say the number is somewhere in between what the government is telling us, and that is that CPI is about 1.7%. And we'll split the difference between that and what Shadow Stats is saying at 10%. So we'll just ballpark it and say the real rate of inflation is about 6%. So 5 or 6%, I think that's something we can all agree on. Makes sense. It's not outrageous to assume that the prices you are paying for stuff daily going up at a 5% clip. So in order for the United States to get on the same pace that Weimar Germany was on, 1914 to 1918, you'd have to see the CPI, or at least what the government would admit to, go up to, let's call it 8, maybe 10%, because that would imply the real rate of inflation was about 15%, and the 15% compounded, just to reiterate, gives us 100% over 5 years, the same thing that Germany saw between 1914 and 1918. So the first signal you need to look for is the official CPI going up over 8%, similar to what we saw in the 1970s. Now let's go over the second signal. The book talked about how the money supply went up by 9 times during this time frame. So what would that mean in terms of our current money supply in the United States, or the M2 as measured by the government or the Fed? Well, we know over the past year alone, it's gone up by 25%. So how high would it have to go up per year to get us on the same pace that Weimar Germany was on when they were sowing the seeds of their hyperinflation? Well, if we do the back of the napkin math, M2 money supply in 5 years would have to be at about 150 trillion. Right now, it's about 20 trillion. So a lot of you are saying to yourself, George, that is impossible. There's no way that that could ever happen. Just hold that thought just for a moment. So if we saw M2 money supply, assuming we start at 15 trillion, which is where we were roughly prior to the cerveza sickness, and we extend that out another 5 years and we're at 150 trillion, we would need to increase M2 money supply per year by 60%. But keep in mind, just last year, we increased it by 25%. So is it that much of a stretch when we think about UBI, permanent stimulus checks, increasing unemployment benefits, reparations, the Green New Deal? Is it outrageous to think that we could get up to this number very quickly? I don't think so. There are no certainties, only probabilities. But I think the probabilities are far greater than zero that our money supply over the next 5 years increases by 60% per annum. And let's also remember, the book said that the government debt went up even more than the money supply. So our government debt currently is about 28 trillion. So it would have to go up to, let's call it 200 trillion in the next 5 years. And again, this is a number that's kind of mind-blowing, that seems completely impossible. But let's go back to 2019 for a moment. If I told you at the beginning of 2019 that our debt would increase from around 23 trillion up to 28 trillion, you would have said the exact same thing. George, that's impossible. That's never going to happen. If I would have told you that M2 money supply would increase by 25% in the next year, you would have said the exact same thing. So I want to make sure today in 2021, we're not constrained by what is possible, when in 2020, we've seen the impossible come to fruition right in front of our own eyes. Step number 3. What is the end game? We talked about what could happen over the next 5 years with specific metrics such as CPI and M2 money supply, and what we should look out for that may signal the seeds of hyperinflation are being sown. But let's look beyond that to try to figure out, if we get to those numbers discussed in step number 2, what happens next? How does this all play out? To understand that better, let's go right back to the book, Dying of Money. After the war, Germany and all the other combatants underwent price inflations, which served as partial corrections for their wartime financing practices. In other words, the inflation reduced the overall burden of the nominal debt for all parties involved. The year 1919 was a year of violent inflation in every country, including the United States. By the spring of 1920, German prices had reached 17 times their pre-war level. From this point, however, Germany and the other nations diverged. The others, including the United States, stopped their deficit spending and began to take their accumulated economic medicine by the way of an acute recession in 1920-1921. In fact, in the United States, it was a depression. Their prices fell steeply from the 1920 level. Germany alone continued to inflate and store up not only the price of the war, but also the price of the new boom, which it then commenced enjoying. So, economic boom Germany had between 1920 and 1921. And remember, if we go back to the chart we used in step number 2, editor, go ahead and throw that up. The mark actually increased in value relative to the United States dollar. This was the calm before the monetary storm or monetary hurricane, which in 1923 turned into a monetary Armageddon. And the book goes on to describe this further. Germany's remarkable prosperity was the envy of the other leading countries, including the countries that actually won the war, who were in serious economic difficulties at the time. Prices in Germany stabilized and remained rock steady during the 15 months in 1920 to 1921. And there was therefore no surface inflation at all. But at the same time, the government began again to pump out deficit expenditure, business credit, and money at a renewed rate. I want to emphasize what it just said there. Business credit. So I'm not going to go and read the whole book here, but in other readings, it pointed out that banks during this economic boom really started to lend. They got caught up in FOMO, just like everyone else. So they increased their bank lending significantly. Well, what did this do? It increased the money supply. More on that in just a moment. Germany's money supply doubled again during this period of stable prices. And you can imagine all the MMT people at the time, or the equivalent back then, saying, oh, all you Austrian economists, you're just fear-mongering. We can print as much money as we want to, and we never have to worry about inflation. Don't you understand that we're a currency issuer? We're not a currency user. Same exact stuff that you hear today. But what the MMTers of the day didn't realize is when Germany was sublimely unconscious of the fiscal monsters in its closet, which was undoubtedly the turning of the tide toward the inflationary smash. Their words, not mine. The catastrophe of 1923 was begotten not in 1923 or at any time after the inflation began to mount, but in the relatively good times of 1920 to 1921. And I'd also like to point out that the crescendo of this hyperinflation, where it got to its maximum, what we saw in 1923, was triggered by the seas of marks which had been stored up by the Germans, and especially by trusting foreigners, flooded forth and fought to buy into other investments, foreign currencies, tangible goods, almost anything but marks. And we hear today the argument against this is that dollars are being used to such a degree outside the United States that the US dollar could never go through a period of hyperinflation. But at some point, Gresham's law is always going to kick in, and the bad money is going to chase out the good money. So in 1920 to 1921, Germany experiences an economic boom. It's a miracle, and it's all a result of creating mo money, mo money, mo money.
More money, more money, more money.
But what was shocking is the mark actually went up against the US dollar during the same time frame. From 1920 to the end of 1921, the mark increases in value. Another thing I wanted to point out, the book detailed, was 1920 to 1921 and the preceding few years where they really started to crank up the currency unit creation. They had a lot of civil unrest, and you can understand why. The rich were getting richer, and they were hollowing out the middle class. The wealth gap was increasing substantially, something we see happening right now in the United States. And during this time, commercial bank lending really increased as well. They had FOMO. They wanted to get in on the action. They didn't want to get left behind. We didn't see that around 2004 to maybe 2008. No, we don't know what that's like at all. Another thing we need to think through in regards to additional bank lending is the Eurodollar system that Jeff Snider has taught us about so well. This is the shadow banking system that's creating all of these additional dollars onshore and offshore that aren't picked up by the M2 money supply numbers. So as an example, if M2 money supply is, let's say, this big as measured by the government, the statistics we used in step number 1 and 2, but the dollars in the entire system, when you include the shadow banking system, are far greater if M2 goes up by 25%. But the amount of dollars in the shadow banking system go down by 15%. On net total, you would have a reduction in the total supply of currency units because this number is so much bigger than this number. And I also want to point out the other way that the M2 money supply can increase in the real economy. Usually, it's not through the government spending money and the Fed monetizing it, like we talked about before. Typically, it's through the commercial banking system creating more money supply or currency units by creating additional loans. Usually, the commercial banking system is responsible for creating the majority of the new money supply by lending it into existence. So let's go back to 1920 and 21, where we had this boom time from the government creating currency. The banks got in and did the exact same thing. So you had currency creation on steroids, not just from the government, but the banking system as well. This leads to the shadow number going up, in addition to the number that we get from the government or the Fed. The main takeaway here is this time period between 1920 and 1922 was really key. They thought that they had discovered an economic miracle by just creating more currency units, more broad money. But this triggered the inflation they saw in 1922, which then triggered Gresham's law. We talked about that at the end of the reading. So let's think about this. If we go through a period of high inflation in the United States, that could be the catalyst for all those dollars that are outside of the United States coming home to buy any asset they can possibly get their hands on, in addition to Gresham's law kicking in inside the United States and all the Americans who are holding dollars in their bank account getting rid of them as fast as they can to buy any type of hard asset. This is the difference between inflation, stagflation, and hyperinflation. So the possible timeline is over the next 5 years, we experience 1970s level inflation while the money supply increases substantially. This brings on a boom phase where everything is great. That gets the banks lending even more money into existence, along with the government's MMT, which takes us straight into a period of Gresham's law. Once we see Gresham's law, that's when we know we're going to be in a period of hyperinflation. This is a possible scenario. As far as the probabilities, I'll leave that for you to decide. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.